Welcome back in Solitude with myself, DJ Hero. In this video, I'm going to go over how I approach processing and mixing my melody elements. Previously, we tackled percussion. We've walked through the bass line. Now it's time to bring the melody elements into the mix. Fair warning, in today's video, I am going to be using mostly third-party plugins, specifically the FabFilter suite. I feel I get the best results with them, though the big principles of this video can be applied with any set of plugins that you have access to and that you like to use. Before we jump in, some basic principles I think about as I go through the process are, one, what is the sound's role in the mix? Is it a lead sound, a supporting sound, a texture to another sound? Two, I think about the stereo spectrum, specifically the width of the sound in the mix. Is it a wide sound? Is it more narrow or mono? Is it panning back and forth? Has it been panned purposefully from one side, to one side or another? Three, I think about what frequencies are most important to that sound. Is this a high-end sound where I can carve out a lot of mids and lows because they aren't necessary? Is it a mid-range texture? If so, where does it belong in the mix relative to the sounds it's supporting? Four, I think about what sort of depth the sound needs to do the job I want it to do. Does it need a lot of reverb or delay to bring it to life? Five, I think about what sort of movement does the sound make? Does it move through the frequency spectrum like an arpeggiator might do, going from a low note to a higher note? Does it move left to right with a little bit of panning? So as you can see, there's a lot to go through, a lot to think about when processing and mixing several parts of a melody together to get that cohesive sound set. But let's get started. Here's what the final product sounds like. As you can see, the whole sound set is made up of 6 sounds with a 7th channel acting as my sidechain. If you'd like to learn more about that and why I've got that in there, check out tutorial number 3, lead melody processing. As you can see here, I have a main synth and a supporting texture to it. They sound like this. And then together. I have an arpeggiator. I have this kind of choir or chorus pad. And then I have this synth here, which is acting like a texture to the top end notes of the melody. And as you can see, there are 2 different melodies here. The second one kind of accents and makes it a little more epic. And then the final sound in the mix here is this sub pad. It's sort of the bass line of the entire sound set. So let's dig in and get this done. First, I always start with the main sound. Like my principle surrounding the kick drum, the main synth lead is the foundation. It's the constant in the mix. I want it to be wide in the mix. I want it to have the most depth in the mix with respect to reverb and delays, the movements and warmth that come with those. And then ultimately, I'm going to mix all of the other elements in the sound set around that to support that main sound. And that is how I'm going to create that big, bright, warm kind of melody sound set, if you will. So let's start with just that main synth. Get that turned up here, and it sounds like this. So pretty dry. Bring up our analyzer so that I can keep track of what the sound is doing with respect to the frequency ranges. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a bit of compression to that sound. Nothing extreme, just something that kind of gets a little grip on it. I'll have a ratio of 2, and then I'll adjust the attack here in just a second. But I'm going to bring this down, not a whole heck of a lot. Again, this particular sound is my main, my lead, so I want it to really pop in the mix. Too much there. Bring that down about there. We don't want any peaking, so always, always, always pay attention to what the output and ultimately the input of your plugins are. You want to make sure you're gain staging all those plugins so that you don't have any sort of peaking or clipping. And now what's this sound doing here? It's got a little mid kind of peak in the mid-range. Not a whole lot in the lows. I believe that's because I have an EQ on the actual synth cutting that part. Yeah. Yep. So I'm going to bring this part from right about, we'll say 1200, 1300. We're going to boost from 1300 hertz and up. We're going to increase that. So we need an EQ. So 1300, and I want it to be a shelf. So it's got a little peaking there, so let's turn that down. So we can see down here in my analyzer, got good width from left to right. It's really filling out that spectrum. We have the high end here. Looks pretty well, pretty good. All right. So it might be, easy to say, okay, well, the next step is we're going to add reverb to this sound. Well, let's slow down just a little bit, because this sound right below it, what I've labeled the texture, it is a sound that's adding to this main sound. This main sound is not the lead as a whole. So these two sounds together, they make up what I would consider the lead element of this mix. So I'm going to quickly just group these two together here, and we're going to call this mains, just to have a name for it. So these two sounds. So let's then move to this one here, and it sounds kind of a plucky sound, right? But together, so this sound, in relation to the other sound, is going to be doing a little more of the mid-range in the mix. And it doesn't need to be as wide in the mix. So first off, I'm going to grab a utility. And we're going to bring the width in just a little bit, about 70. Then I'm going to add another compressor. I'm going to set it similar to the one on the main here. A little ratio of 4. And then the attack, 25. And this is just to kind of grab some peaks. It's not to squish the sound or to really flatten it out. It's just to kind of hammer down those peaks that might cause a little bit of a mess in the mix. And then I'll bring it in with the main. So right now, this texture is a little loud relative to the main for what I have in my head, what I want the sounds to sound like. So I'm going to turn it down a bit. There we go. It's about right. My objective here is I really want the attack of that kind of pluckiness in the texture sound to sit with the breath and higher end of the main sound. And the next step here is I'm going to add an EQ. And this EQ, we were at 1300 on the other sound. The shelf, I'm going to bring that down just a little bit, because this frequency range belongs to the main sound, so we don't need all that here. Now you'll see this one on the pluck, this texture, has low end, and that's what I want. I want it to fill out from this 1300 hertz on down the range, with the mids being the primary, so maybe a little bit of a little boost in the mid-lows to add some harmonics in there. And then adjust the levels just a bit to make up for, or to compensate for, that EQing I just did. All right. So really simple on these two sounds. Now, because I've grouped them together, here's where I'm going to do a little bit of final processing to these mains, this lead sound. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I have a multi-band compressor here. I've programmed my own kind of preset, but basically what I'm going to do is I have these broken into 4 bands. This is 150 hertz below, so that's all low end. All right. And then this band here, the green one, is 150 hertz to 1200 hertz. And then 1200 hertz on up to 8000 hertz. And then 8000 hertz up to the very top. And then I'm just going to use this to shape this set of sounds, the mains. And I'm really going to get a grip on the low end here. It doesn't need to have a whole lot of range. I don't really want the low end to have a whole lot of movement in the mix, right? So the idea of the compressor here, the more you compress a sound, the less range that sound can move through. I'm basically saying, all right, I'm going to stop you here, and I'm going to stop you here. And you can only move around in between there. So if I have a lot of range, the sound's going to move a whole heck of a lot. The more I squeeze that range together, the less space it has to move in. So the low end doesn't need a whole lot of movement. And the whole time here, I'm paying attention to this meter because I really want it to be fairly well balanced, right? Now here, because we're still near the lower end of things, I want less movement, less space for the sound to move in. So less range, a little more compression here, really bring that in. I'm going to bring this one down a bit more as well. And I don't need the attack, so we're going to make this one more like a limiter. There we go. Let's bring this attack in a bit. Now let's switch to the blue one here. This is now in the mid-high section of the sound. And this is where we want most of that range, because this is where you're going to hear most of that range. I've always thought of everything from the mid to mid-low and low is more of the harmonics texture, right? The harmonic textures, and everything from the mid-high, and high is the movement kind of textures of the sound, especially when you have a complex range of sounds or frequencies in a sound set like your melodies will. So I want this one to have the most range. Some compression here, and then we're going to make up for what I've done here. All the while listening to go, okay, can I hear this frequency range just as easily as I hear this frequency range and this one? If one or the other kind of stands out too much, it might be worth turning it down a little bit so that they're all sort of balanced. You don't want your ears to have to fight for any specific range in that frequency spectrum. You want it to be kind of natural to hear everything. And then, of course, we'll go to the high end here. Most range. A little compression on there. Bring that in, and then we'll turn it up. Turn this one up a little bit. Pretty good. Let's check this really quick. This one could use a little more. There we go. Now you can see we're peaking here. So let's give ourselves some headroom. Turn that down 3 decibels. Okay. So next thing I'm going to do, now that I have this multiband on here, is we're going to create our reverb and our delay chains. So first up, drop an EQ on here just to have a plugin to create the chain with. We're going to group that and that. We're going to call this one the main. I'm not going to really do anything with this EQ, at least not yet. And then I'm going to duplicate it twice. Quickly mute these. Call this one reverb. And I'm going to grab the Ableton Cathedral reverb setting. Make sure it's 100% wet, and I'm actually going to put it before the EQ in the chain here. Because rather than use the kind of built-in EQ, I'm going to use the aftermarket one here. That's not what I want. So with the reverb, I'm basically going to cut off the low end. I don't want that muddying up the mix. And I'm going to cut off the extreme high end here just by rolling it down. Just like that. Next step, I'm going to add our sidechain compressor. Set to attack to 0.1. The release is at 50 milliseconds. Now, if you watched my previous video, you'll know that this synth sidechain pattern, which is just the same notes as what's on the main melody, is now going to be the signal that tells the sidechain compressor what to do. So we're going to select from the inputs here, synth sidechain. And now basically what we're doing is we're ducking the reverb around the notation of the melody, right? Okay, so now we'll go down to this one here and call this one delay. Grab my delay, put it before the EQ. And I'm going to do a little cutoff on this one at 3000 hertz and a little high pass at 150. I'm going to turn the ping pong on. I'm going to bring the feedback to about 50. It's 100% wet. And this one, the dotted 1/8 is where I want it. Turn that on. And I'm going to set this similarly with respect to the EQing. Now, this is the EQ from the delay. I'm going to give it a little peak here. And then quickly I'm going to grab the EQ from the reverb. And I'm going to get a little peak here. So they're kind of offset. Grab this and duplicate this side chain over to the delay here. And then give it a listen. Make sure the levels of both the reverb and the delay aren't overpowering. We can turn them down like this. Ultimately, I want them behind the actual sounds of the melody, not engulfing, what's the word I want there? Engulfing or enveloping. Try to mix those two words. Engulfing. New word. Check it out. Merriam-Webster's. All right. There we go. Now, after that, I'm going to grab an instance of my FabFilter, the FabFilter Saturn, which is a saturation plugin. I basically have a default setting of a 3-band here. This is my mid-range, little gentle saturation. You'll notice that it is outside of the effects rack. Give it a little dynamic hue here. Kind of boost the harmonics in the mid-range there. All the while keeping an eye on, right? You'll see that I'm kind of getting mid-heavy. I'm going to compensate for that by doing some saturation on the high end of this melody to bring the breath back into it. And then I'm not going to add any saturation to the low end. It doesn't need it. It's good where it's at. And then just to check here, we'll watch the levels. Here's the 3 sounds we're working with. We're not peaking, but just in case, the last thing I'm going to add is just a limiter, and it's not going to be doing anything, hopefully, aside from adding a ceiling. That I set it to negative 0.3 decibels. I find that the way the plugin interpolates the limiting, the 0.3 actually ends up being 0 on the output. Not sure why, but I've noticed that when rendering out waves to MP3s as well with the dithering. So just safe bet, negative 0.3 decibels. And as you can see, it's not doing anything. But just in case. So that is the main sound for our mix. So that is the foundation sound for all of the other sounds. So the next thing I'm going to do, the next sound I'm going to work with is I'm going to bring in the sound that has the most movement, if you will. And when I say movement, I mean from through the stereo spectrum, left and right, as well as the frequency spectrum. does it, the low end notes, the high end notes, the amount of movement that any one sound does. So in this particular case, it is the arpeggiator here because it does go from a low note to a higher note based on how it's been written. And it sounds so you can hear, if you're listening on good monitors or in headphones, there is some panning, and you can see that the auto pan plugin is on there. The arpeggiation is being done by the Ableton arpeggiator, and it's just a simple serum patch, a little bit of a pluck that I made. Not a fancy sound. And you can see also, I don't have any effects on it. Not that I'm against having or using onboard effects for your plugins, but when it comes to mixing, I'd rather have the effects after the fact where they're all similar to the environment I'm working in. So the effects that are on the plugin, I use those to shape the sound itself as opposed to be the effects like your reverbs and your delays. So if this sound didn't need it, then I'm not going to force myself to go, hey, I need a whole bunch of different effects on here. Nope, just a simple sound. Arpeggiated, got a little bit of panning. First thing I'm going to do, you guessed it, I'm going to add a little bit of a compressor on here. Now this one doesn't need any punch. I just really want it to kind of grab hold of the sound. So I'm going to use actually let's kick the ratio up to 3. Pretty quick attack and a fairly decent release. Probably could actually be a little bit slower, but get a grip on it here. Again, I'm not trying to over compress the sound, really just kind of tackle the peaks, if you will. Give it a hug. And then we'll boost the output a little just to kind of give me some mixing console controls. All right. And then after that, I'm going to drag an EQ onto the chain here. And I don't need the low end. We know that the sounds above it that we just got done working with, they are going to contain most of the low end. So when you've got a sound that has a lot of movement, that is bouncing around in the mix from left to right, that does work its way through all of the frequencies, you really got to carve that sound up and sit it in the mix, or it's going to really overrun the mix because it is moving, right? You're going to get changes throughout everything because of the movement of this sound. So I don't want any of the low end, so I'm going to cut 150 below. I could probably cut a little more. Back off just a little. So right around 230, perfect. Now let's check the top end here. And when I hit that button, what I'm doing is I'm hearing what this part of the EQ is doing. So what is it actually cutting, because it's a brick wall here. So you can see that there are frequencies in there, transients and what have you, but we don't need them. They're really not a part of the sound. Give it a listen. You hear them slightly. I'm cutting them. I'm getting rid of them all. And I'm really basically carving this sound to sit within this range. So my theory on EQing, if the frequency range isn't necessary for it to A, sound good, and B, sit in the mix, get rid of it. That's just a quick theory, quick tip right there. And we can see down here the movement. All right. Now, there's an awful lot of reverb on the main and the texture. So for now, I'm going to leave this sound dry of reverb. I might add a little after the fact, but for now, it's just going to be dry. So what I'm going to do really quick here is I'm going to mute the sound, bring in the mains, and then turn it up to where I like it. And when I say like it, what I'm looking for is, do my ears hear it without having to be told to focus on it? You want that natural, hey, I'm listening to a melody. Oh, there's sounds in there. There's things moving around. If you have to force your ear to look for it, it might be too quiet. Similarly, if I turn it up too loud and it overpowers the main, it's distracting me from hearing the main. I think that's good. And we'll go back to it. We'll touch back on it as we add in more sounds. But for now, about right in there is good. All right. So moving on, the next sound that we're going to address is going to be our choir pad. So we'll focus on it here. Now this sound, these mid-high and high range pads, I kind of think of them as like they fill out a mix. When I was putting this together, I kept kicking around the kind of the description, the adjective of it's like sand, but then all the jokes around that if you are a pop culture Star Wars fan. But sand gets everywhere, right? And really what I want this sound to do is to fill in all the nooks and crannies in that frequency, the entire frequency range. I want it to be nice and wide in the mix. I want it to fill out a great portion of the frequencies. I'm going to cut the low end because I do have another pad down here that's doing the low end portion of it. But this sound, I want it to be big, full, wide, and really warm. So as you can see, it's not really wide in the mix. So let's tackle that portion of it first. First things first, I'm going to add an EQ, and I'm going to roll off the low end. And that's cutting off quite a bit, so perfect there. Now I'm going to create a chain and call that the main. I'm going to give it a quick duplicate. I'm going to call this the stereo, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to add just a delay. And I went over this in a previous video as well about how to make things wider using a delay. So I have my stereo width. I don't want any of the dry signal. I want all the wet signal. Now let's put them together here. A lot wider right there. So now that we've got a nice wide sound that both will work on the nice speakers with good stereo response, it'll also, because we have the dry signal, 100% dry, work on pretty crummy kind of mono systems that you might find in a nice underground party. So you got best of both worlds here. Once we've got that basic widened signal, I'm going to add a compressor. I'm going to bring that to 3. Really a fast attack, and we could probably slow that down to 350, but I really want to bring this together. On this one, I really am trying to squeeze them together. I want to squeeze that main mono signal in with the stereo signal. Right? And then the next thing I'm going to add in the mix here, I'm going to add reverb, but it's going to be just a little bit, and I want it nice and wide. Nice big room. It's kind of an angelic pad, so I want it to feel like it's got the space of all the heavens, if you will, right? To get all cheesy. And then the last thing I want, after I got a little bit of reverb on there, is a final EQ. You'll see we're pretty heavy in the 1500 to the 150 range. So it might be worth giving a little boost to the highs. And then similarly and quite oppositely, I'm going to bring down the lows just to balance the sound out a little bit. You'd really have to do some pretty extreme EQing to fully balance the sound, but I just want it to be a little bit more audibly balanced. And then, again, like I did with the arpeggiator, I'm going to turn the sound all the way down, turn on the other sounds, and mix it in. And I want it to really feel warm and fill up that mix. I don't necessarily want it to be louder than the arpeggiator that we just got done working with, but I want it to embrace it with respect to how it interacts with all of the other sounds. Like I said, I want it to fill in all the cracks, all the little frequency ranges that are open and that move around. I want it to be the hug that embraces all of the other sounds. But at the same time, I don't want it to overpower the mains. So if I turn it up and I feel like, well, I'm losing my ability to naturally hear those main synths, those main keyboard lines, I should turn it down. I like it right in here. I kind of going back and forth. Do I want it a little louder or a little less? But I think we're going to go with right there. So then before I move on to the next two sounds, I'm going to go back and just kind of take a look here and go, okay, can I still hear my mains properly? When I added this pad, this choir pad, did I lose the ability to hear the arpeggiator sound at all? If so, we need to do a little bit of EQing. So let's do that. Let's solo the arpeggiator and solo the choir and take a look at what's happening in the frequencies here. Solo the arpeggiator. So it's mostly here. We're looking at 950 to 200. If we go to the other one, we're looking at 200, heavy in the 13 range there. I'll go back to the other one real quick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little I got movement in here, okay? So I've been describing movement through the frequency range going from low notes to high notes, which you can see in the spikes. 1, 2, 3, 4, right? It's kind of spiking as it climbs up. So we're looking at 900 down to 213, 215. I'm going to go back to the chorus here, bring my EQ back up, and then 900. Let's split the difference. If we're at 900 here, 213 here, so halfway in the middle, I'm just going to bring that down a little bit. Just to give it a little bit of space, we're going to notch kind of a gentle, not a tight notch, just a gentle. And then we'll go back to the arpeggiator here and bring its EQ up. Where are we at? This one's at 436. 436. We're going to bring that up just not much, just a little bit, kind of offset them a little. Now let's bring them together. I feel like I could use a little more of this choir, but let's hear them all with everything together. Yeah, so what I want to do is I want to turn both of these down just a little bit. So I basically highlighted them both, and now when I drag one slider, they'll both move. Remember, when I said at the beginning, the main is my constant. I'm not going to turn it up. Instead, I'm going to turn everything around it down. Right in there. Perfect. All right. So now that we've got all those, we'll move on to the next sound, which in this case is the tops. So the tops, they sound like this. And they are accenting the high end. So we really want to bring out and focus on the mid-high to high range frequencies. And I feel like there's a reverb on here. Now, this was a preset that I made a while back, so I'm just going to quickly turn that reverb off because I don't want that one on. Perfect. All right. So first things first, grab our compressor just to grab the peaks. And this one I want to add a little pop, so we're going to have a kind of a slower attack. Bring that to about a 4 ratio. I'm going to change this to opto. And then a faster release. That's going to allow me to kind of get the attack snappy. Turn it up a little. And then on this one, I'm also going to add back a bit of the dry signal to get more of the tail. Good, good. Okay. So next up, my EQ here. And then cut off everything we don't need. So we know that most of the sound is happening. What are we looking at here? From about 500 hertz up. So let's grab here, we'll mute this. So that mid-range right there, I don't think I need it. There we go. So it sounds a little thin with the brick wall. Maybe let me do something like that. There we go. So then really quick, I'm going to go back to the mains here, and I'm going to grab this rack, because I want this rack but I want less delay, more reverb. I want it to have a little bit of a wash in the mix. A little bit of movement. Let's pull these out front of this. Because that compressor is now after the reverb, it's bringing that out a little bit, so I'm going to turn it down a little bit more. And I'm going to pull this up on the high end here. Perfect. Okay, so really quick, I'm going to bring it, we're going to turn it down, and then I'm going to bring just the mains and the tops. So it's the mains are soloed, and now the tops. And I'm going to bring the tops in. Now I'm going to bring in the arp because it's got the most movement. Still hear it. And as I'm listening, again, can't stress enough, as I'm listening, I want to make sure that my ear can naturally hear each of the sounds. I don't want it to have to fight to hear any one sound in the mix, and I want it to be able to hear all the sounds together just as easily. Now I'm going to bring in the choir pad. Looks good. Now really quick, check my meter here. Pretty well balanced sound. Doing pretty good so far. All right, so now the last sound to work with is the sub. And the sub, just a simple, and again, I firmly believe it's just a saw wave. Yep, we got a little cutoff going on, and then we have some EQ and distortion. Now you'll see that I have the EQ here set to 150, kind of cutting it off, but on the oscillator I have the sub direct out, so it's not being affected by the effects here. If you're familiar with Serum, you'll get why I've done it that way. Got some distortion to add a little warmth, and then compressor just kind of gluing it all together. And then as far as this one goes, first things first, I kind of want to, so the notion behind, the thought behind this compressor is I want the higher note to be similar in volume as the lower note. In this particular case, the notation on this here, the MIDI notation on the right sound, there we go. Right, this D is going to sound different than this lower G. The reason being just the speed of the wave, right? The amount of time it takes for it to make full loop. So this is going to sound more audible, this one's going to feel more bassy. And I kind of want to use the compressor to balance them out so that the volume remains the same throughout, because it is sort of the low end table, if you will, that all these other sounds are sitting on. So I'm going to do about 4, really a fast attack, almost like a limiter. Kick that up. In fact, let's treat this like a limiter. And then we'll do a little post gain here so we can see it. Brick walled that. So you see on the higher notes it's doing less, but as it moves down each note, the compressor's having to do more and more, which is exactly what I want. And then we're going to add an EQ, and I'm going to roll off, much like, or opposite rather, what we were doing on the other one, like that. I'm going to do this one the other way. I'm going to turn this into this. I'm going to turn that down, give us a little overhead here. All right. I'm going to bring that up a little. And I'm going to bring this up just a little. Good. And really what I want it to be is just kind of balanced as it progresses through that note progression. All right. So then, instead of going and kind of balancing it to the mains, I'm going to balance it to this other pad here. So I'm going to turn it down really quick. Solo in these pads, and now bring it in to it's at a good level, balanced with what these pads are doing. It's a little heavy, but we're going to leave it there for now. So now let's play all of them. Pretty well balanced. I'm good with it. I hear the main notes, they stand out, but I can easily shift my focus to the arpeggiator. I can then shift to the choir pad. The top notes aren't standing out too much from the main melody. They're balanced with it. And then the sub, filling out that low end. Perfect. Good balance. So even though we've got it now mixed down pretty well and each sound is processed individually, one more step to go. So let's collapse all these just to get some space here. And I'm going to go to the actual bus itself. Now currently there are no effects on it. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add my multiband just like we did with the mains here. Grab my default setting. And I'm going to kind of add a little breath, but at the same time get a grip and on all the sounds as a whole, right? Kind of like each individual compressor on each of the individual sounds. That's what this is going to do. So first things first, the low end. I need very little range. I want this one to be kind of rock solid. Compress it, bring the threshold down. All right. Now we're going to bring in the mid-low range here. A little more range. And I'm going to treat this just like I'm mixing any sounds. I want them to be balanced. Like that's too much. That's too little. That's pretty good. All right, now I'm going to unmute the low and switch to the mid-low, mid-high. And work just with the mids. A little more range, because we're going to have more movement as we move up. We're going to be able to audibly hear more movement as we go through the higher end of the frequencies. A little faster release time than before. And bring it down just so we hear what's going on. Too much. Bring the low in. Pretty good, pretty good, pretty good. All right, so turn this off and this off. Now let's go to the mid-high, high. And this we're going to have a lot more range. Bit more compression or threshold on there. Faster release, and then we'll turn it up. That's pretty well balanced. Now, next step, I'm going to get rid of that, bring in the mid-low. A little more high. Let's hear it as a whole. Now, of course, we got a little peaking here, so let's stage that. Give us a little overhead. Perfect. Looking back at our analyzer here, it's pretty well balanced. So then the last step, well, maybe not the last step, but we're getting close to it. I'm going to Grab my multi-band saturator, the Fab Filter Saturn. And similarly, I'm going to add a little gentle, not much. It's pretty well balanced. Just want to add a little saturation in the mid-range. But that's obviously too much. Okay, now let's go to the high end here. Same thing. Add a little breath to the top. I'm going to turn it up just a little. We don't want it to be kind of unnatural or forced. Mess with the dynamics a little bit. There we go. I like it. Okay. And then the last step, I'm going to add an EQ. And basically, this EQ, the final EQ in the mix here, is going to help when we bring all of the pieces together, the percussion, the bass line, the melody, any effects, any vocals, things like that. But for right now, before we get to that step, which will be in a later video, I just want to use the EQ to address any kind of little spikes, little peaks that might pop up that are unnatural. Now, there aren't really any. I feel like I can use a little more low end. I can either do it by adding it here, or I could go back to the multi-band compressor and do it. We'll just do it right here. And I'm gonna actually take this and do only the mids, so the mono portion. All right. Pretty well balanced. Sounds pretty good. It's nice and wide. You can hear all the sounds clearly. You don't have to fight to hear any one sound. The melody stands out. It sounds warm. It's got some depth. It's got some texture to it. That's that. We've just got it all mixed together and processed, sounding good. And that is the head to toe on how I go about processing my melodies and synth sounds. If you have any additional questions, please leave them in the comments section below. Additionally, if you've got any ideas for future videos, please let me know. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, hit that notification button. And as always, if you want more from me, search Originaldjhero, all one word, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, SoundCloud, and Mixcloud, or search DJ Hero on Beatport, iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play. Until next time, have fun in your own projects. We'll see you soon.